This is the first ballot result. Take a look at that very big result for Pierre Poilievre. He took 70% of the popular vote of the more than 400,000 members who cast a ballot, leaving the other candidates, as you can see there, trailing far behind. The new Tory leader made his focus clear while addressing caucus.
Canadians are hurting, and it is our job to transform that hurt into hope, and that is my mission. And so I'm issuing a challenge to Justin Trudeau today. If you really understand the suffering of Canadians, Mr. Prime Minister, if you understand that people can't gas their cars, feed their families, or afford homes for themselves, if you really care, commit today that there will be no new tax increases on workers and on seniors. None.
The CBC's Catherine Cullen is here with all of the reaction to Poilievre's win. Hi, Catherine.
Hey,
you've been in and out of caucus, talking to various Conservative MPs about how they feel. What are they saying today?
Unity, 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 unity. That is the word of the day, Vashi. And, you know, that kind of economic message that we just heard from Pierre Poilievre, that is a unifying message I think we can acknowledge in the Conservative caucus. You also talked about the results from Saturday night. You know, those are pretty unifying, too. If you know that Pierre Poilievre won your riding, which it's very likely he did since he won almost every riding in the country in terms of the Conservative leadership votes, that, too, might convince you to get on side with Mr. Poilievre. Now, that said, does not mean that there are not rifts in the caucus. Certainly there are a significant number of MPs who backed Jean Charest. Pierre Poilievre did have a surprise meeting with the Quebec caucus this morning. He showed up. MPs don't want to talk about what happens in those private meetings, but they did say generally that he listened. They all seemed very enthusiastic about his decision to show up and hear them out. They took that as a good sign. Let's listen to a little sampling of how some MPs reacted as they were heading into that larger caucus meeting today.
He's the guy that can unite the party, and I think Canadians have hope.
I am relieved that what I would call our war of succession is over. Mr. Poilievre received a crushing mandate that I think is going to provide some much-needed stability to our caucus.
Well, excited to be Conservative again, to have a leader who will stand up for our values and our principles.
I can tell you that having spoken to many of my colleagues, there is an excitement about getting to work.
A lot going on there, Vashi. Michelle Rumpel-Garner, of course, people may remember backing Patrick Brown. She was one of his co-chairs. Shannon Stubbs, if you didn't notice it, there was definitely a little dig there, excited to be Conservative again. I think a reference to the previous leader. But one of the interesting discussions I had was with Ed Fast, who folks may remember actually stepped down from his role as finance critic because he said he was essentially being bullied by the Pierre Poilievre people. He disagreed with Poilievre's decision to call for the firing of the governor of Bank of Canada. A lot of to and fro. So we asked him today, you know, Mr. Fast, how are you feeling? You sticking around? He said, I'm sticking around. It's important we all unify. I said, well, does that mean that you're going to start calling for the firing of the governor of the Bank of Canada? No. So, you know, unity can be a little bit complicated, but as anyone who stepped in front of the cameras today was only talking about staying in the fold. How all of that works, well, we'll see how that plays out.
And speaking of, you know, one of Mr. Poilievre's proposals at the outset of this campaign, which was firing the Bank of Canada's governor, it's part of what the Prime Minister zeroed in on today. He also was addressing caucus and also decided to weigh in on Pierre Poilievre's win.
That's right. I mean, we heard it in the introduction there. Buzzwords, dog whistles, and careless attacks. You and I probably remember seeing Dominic LeBlanc at the Conservative meeting the other night talking about reckless and irresponsible, reckless and irresponsible. That was a message that we very much heard from the Prime Minister today as well, and he picked up on specific policy proposals. Let's listen to that.
Telling people they can opt out of inflation by investing their savings in volatile cryptocurrencies is not responsible leadership. By the way, anyone who followed that advice would have seen their life savings destroyed.
Picked up on other topics as well, sort of needling Mr. Poilievre, saying he wasn't supportive enough of vaccines, talked about the governor of the Bank of Canada. Interesting to note, though, the Prime Minister was also defending their economic record because, as we heard in the beginning there, that is the unifying issue for the Conservatives. They will be attacking Justin Trudeau on that front, and we have heard the Liberals saying there is some concrete news coming, we think, in the days to come to give us a bit more of a sense of how they're going to show that they're responding to Canadians at the very time that their new adversary says not happening, not good enough.
And probably too little too late, according to the Conservatives. Okay, thanks very much, Catherine. The CBC's Catherine Cullen. We have a lot more to ask about how caucus went, but also what the plan is for a Conservative Party under the new Tory leader, Pierre Poilievre. To get some answers to those questions, I'm joined now by Ontario Conservative MP Michael Barrett. Hi, Mr. Barrett. Good to have you here in person.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I wanted to start off, of course, by congratulating you first on your party's new leader. And I wanted to get your perspective on how you view, or what you view as your party's biggest challenge heading into the federal election, whenever it may be.
So we had obviously a very exciting and successful resolution to our leadership contest with an overwhelming victory for Pierre Poilievre. With an absolute majority in 330 of 338 ridings. So that puts us in a spot where, with people who were excited to join our Conservative movement, have signed on, they've done that, the party has grown, but we still have a lot of, we have a great opportunity to introduce Pierre Poilievre to Canadians. And, to myself and to you, to folks who are political watchers of this show, they would know who Pierre is. But this is going to be an opportunity for a lot of Canadians to get to see what he's all about. And I thought that over the weekend, on Saturday night, and today when he spoke to our caucus, we saw Canadians watching would have seen a preview of the Pierre Poilievre that I know well, and that's one who is really excited to be a husband and a dad, and who talked an awful lot about affordability for Canadians, and we're really looking forward to taking that message to the Canadian public.
On the concept of introducing himself to people who, you're right, are not rabid political watchers at this point, I actually want to jump in there because I think one of his emails prior to even winning, just a few days before or a day before, cited this too, that the Liberals will make an effort to frame him in the absence of Canadians having that full picture. And I want to put to you what the Prime Minister said in that vein about Mr. Poilievre today. He did congratulate him.
Sure.
But said this: buzzwords, dog whistles, and careless attacks don't add up to a plan for Canadians. Attacking the institutions that make our society fair, safe, and free is not responsible leadership. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's disappointing and I think disingenuous of Mr. Trudeau to offer those words. And this is a Prime Minister who, after he and his party had pledged not to call an election last year, he called one during the pandemic. He went to great efforts to divide Canadians. He called groups of Canadians names, and this is a Prime Minister who has not been one who has enhanced Canadian institutions. I want to talk about the incident with the firing of the Attorney General and the interference in our criminal justice system. We have a Prime Minister who's had regular interventions by the Ethics Commissioner, and so it's disingenuous, but I guess not surprising to hear that from the Prime Minister. The message that we've heard from Mr. Poilievre is, I think, one that will give Canadians hope and optimism. And people who are listening to the message that he's offering, that Pierre is offering, will hear that. Now, not listening to what people say about what he says, but what he actually says. And he's talking about, taking care of Canadians, making sure that they've got a paycheck that covers their necessities. We're in a situation in this country where we're coming up on a winter where many Canadians are going to have to choose between heating their homes and feeding their families. And we haven't seen, great concern or action by this government with respect to the affordability crisis that we're facing. And so Mr. Poilievre's message today, I would challenge Mr. Trudeau or others to take a look at that message and say what they disagree with that's in there that's not helpful for Canadians. And I would put the challenge to Mr. Trudeau, will he in fact commit to not raising taxes on Canadians? Because that's the biggest pain point they're feeling right now.
And I do want to ask you about that in a second. And I do take your point around the scrutiny that the Prime Minister and his government deserve. And certainly I spend a large portion of my job on this show doing that. But on the idea of, for example, attacking institutions or making irresponsible suggestions, I did not hear in Mr. Poilievre's address this morning, nor his speech after winning on Saturday, any references to opting into cryptocurrency in order to opt out of inflation. I did not hear him talk about firing the Bank of Canada governor, which he has before. Is that the fact that those things aren't in
I guess I'd say that, to go back to my previous answer, that we're hearing a message of that should be able to give Canadians hope and optimism, and that's what they're focused on. But when we talk about accountability and accountability for appointments that have been made by the Prime Minister, for accountability for the government, I think it's really important that Canadians see that we have political leaders, that we have in the official opposition a party leader who's prepared to commit to protect the integrity of institutions instead of checking out and saying, they're not concerned with monetary policy.
But I take it, and again, you know what, the monetary policy of the central bank in this country and other countries should be scrutinized, right? I think we've even seen Bank of Canada governors, central bank governors, admit that their response was slow. But what Mr. Trudeau, or what the Prime Minister is zeroing in on, and what other critics of Mr. Poilievre have zeroed in on, is the claim about firing the Bank of Canada governor. More specifically, Mr. Poilievre is advocating for less government intervention, but then thinks it's okay for the government to intervene there. Or, for example, if universities aren't allowing for free speech as defined by Mr. Poilievre and your party, to withhold funding. If municipalities aren't building the right type of houses, to withhold funding to municipalities. All of that is bigger government.
I guess that it's important to look at value that Canadians are getting for their money, the value that they're getting with the salary of someone who's responsible for executing on something so important as the ensuring that we're at a set target for an inflationary rate in Canada. Making sure that when we're amidst a housing crisis, that municipalities who are drawing cash from the federal government are accountable to taxpayers, that taxpayers are getting good value for their money. It's really important that we don't just have a government that writes checks and then checks out, and that's in large part what we're seeing with the current government. They think that the amount of money that they spend is a demonstration of the success that they've had instead of actually the results. So there needs to be some accountability. Canadians deserve that. This government has spent more and racked up more debt than any government or all governments combined in history. So there should be some accountability, or Canadians will lose all hope, and they'll say, you know what, this government isn't for me. They're not responsive to the realities of 2022. The realities that their grocery bills have gone up 10% year over year, that 4 in 5 Canadians have cut the amount of food that they're able to buy every week. So when they're having to make sacrifices with their day-to-day life, they can't put gas in the truck to get to their job site. They want to see that the government is responsive to that and holding people accountable. And I think that that's critical.
Look, I think a lot of Canadians will understand those points and agree with them and desire more accountability from institutions and from the government as a whole, especially as you point out, they suffer from an increasing cost of living, a cost of living that is increasing on a daily basis. But there is some nuance to it, right? And there is some level of responsibility that should or could be exercised. And saying that the bank deserves accountability, and even the Bank of Canada governor should answer for his questions, is not the same as saying fire them. Saying that there is too high a level of spending and the government should be held accountable for its role in driving up inflation is not the same as saying that everyone should opt into cryptocurrency so that they can opt out of inflation, right? The point that, or the way that Mr. Poilievre's critics are trying to frame him is as irresponsible, right? As sort of somebody that's not dealing always in the facts. And my question to you is whether, Mr. Poilievre is kind of tacitly acknowledging that by not putting that stuff in the last 2 speeches he made to a broader audience.
I think that what we've seen over the last 7 years is a government that hasn't been responsible. And what we're seeing are proposals that are eminently responsible. And, talking about...
Then why isn't Mr. Poilievre talking about them?
Well, Mr. Poilievre has said what he said. And so I think that his words stand on their own.
So you think it's okay to opt into, he still thinks it's okay to opt into cryptocurrency, even though it's lost 50% of its value since he first made that proposition? I
think that when we have a government that has so readily disregarded the plight of Canadians, and has their inflationary practices like printing money, their practice of continuing to rack up debt, their practice of, instead of addressing the concerns that Canadians are actually facing, and as demonstrated by the premiers of all of the provinces, asking to meet with the Prime Minister to talk about the Canada Health Transfer, the Prime Minister's refusal, And instead, the Prime Minister is saying, you know what, even though we can't execute on basic government services like issuing passports, bringing refugees to this country, processing our immigration files, we can't manage our borders, that they're going to wade into provincial territory and spend what they claim is nearly $5 billion on a program that the parliamentary budget officer says is going to cost $9 billion. So we have a government.
I'm not disagreeing with those assessments, and that's what I ask the government about all the time. My question is about whether or not a solution is Canadians investing in a currency that's lost half its value.
I think it's important that we have conversations as Canadians that are different than just the one that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals want to have, because their approach is not working.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it. I'm out of time, Mr. Barrett. Thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.